Okay, so at the risk of spoiling everything, Christianity doesn't oppress women. Okay, so we're going to talk about that tonight. But let me give you the context for this talk, because there is a context. As you heard, I work at the seminary. I'm now director of admissions, but I was a student at one time. Now I'm a graduate. I graduated out of the MA Apologetics and Philosophy degree programs. So about 4 years ago, we were contacted by a local university, Ratio Christi chapter. Has Eric spoken about what Ratio Christi is?
Yeah.
Okay, Ratio Christi, essentially they're apologetics clubs on campuses. So much like your Campus Crusade for Christ or Atheist and Agnostic Alliance, there's actually an apologetics club on university campuses, which we're quite thankful for. Is everything okay? So we were contacted by the Ratio Christi group at a local university. They had been approached by the Atheist and Agnostic Club. And the Atheist and Agnostic Club, they wanted to debate Ratio Christi on this question: does Christianity oppress women? And so Ratio Christi contacted the seminary, and at the time it was myself and a colleague, Nora Hale, we were there, and we decided that we would be the ones to go discuss with the Atheist and Agnostic Club the question of does Christianity oppress women? So to make a long story short, and it's a huge story, but to make a long story short, a week before we were supposed to have that discussion on campus, they canceled the event because they said that we knew too much about the Bible and they didn't want to talk to us. Which that is a literal quote. They emailed us and said that they didn't want to talk to us. So that discussion didn't happen, but we decided to make this into a talk. Does Christianity oppress women? Because of course, on the local campus, the default answer is yes, of course it oppresses women. But at the very same time, this is also a question, whether stated or unstated, many people in the church want to know whether Christianity is oppressive to women. If they think it isn't oppressive, they want the ideas and the things that they can use to combat those on Facebook and other mediums who say that Christianity is oppressive to women. So that's the context for the talk, and I'm going to speak about a lot of different things because as a result of this talk, I've started studying feminism a little bit more, feminist theology a little bit more, feminist criticism a little bit more. All of those things come to bear in a discussion like this. So I'll be talking, certainly I'll be saying some things that we would have said that night if the discussion wasn't canceled, but I'll be saying a little bit more because obviously in the context of believers, there's questions that we can, and issues and ideas that we can discuss here that wouldn't necessarily be helpful on campus when they don't really even believe that the Bible is the Word of God. So we're going to talk about a lot of different things tonight, and there's going to be a Q&A at the end. But certainly don't wait until the very end. I would really like this to be conversational. I'm sure you all have had your experiences and you have heard things that you want to discuss as well. So we can just make this very interactive, and I think that will be great. Okay? So often the act of speaking about something and doing justice to that thing, it requires setting the stage. So a lot of times this is an apparent question: does Christianity oppress women? I'm not even going to really start there though, because there are starting points that lead to the discussion that we ultimately want to have. So even on the university campus that night, Nora and myself would have said a lot of things about anthropology and sociology and psychology and neurochemistry and those sorts of things. Because there's just a discussion that needs to be had before we even begin to talk about feminism. So I'm going to lay the stage for what feminism is. I'll say a few things after that, and then we'll come back to this idea of does Christianity oppress women. So feminism, if someone had to define feminism, how would you define it? Your understanding of feminism, what would you say?
Woman power. Beyonce.
Spice Girls, depending on, girl power.
Independence.
Independence?
Right. Just an independence from any male well, I don't want to say relationship, but dependence.
Okay.
Of some kind.
Okay. Anyone else? Those are all.
When I think of feminism, I think of anger. You know, they're angry women.
Mhm.
You know, I don't know.
Yeah.
I just get that picture.
Yeah, it's all of the above, I would say. So feminism is not uniquely an American thing, and I always have to say this because I'm Canadian by nationality, and one of the things I find is everything seems to have started in America, but that's not true. So feminism didn't start here in America, but when it got to America, it took on certain waves, what are called waves, the waves of feminism. You all have heard, you know, second wave feminism, third wave feminism, those sorts of things. So feminism in this country began in the 19th century. It was started by women loosely called the suffragists, the first wave feminists, who were concerned ideally about three things. They were concerned about women's inability to enter into contract, to own property, and to vote. So the first wave of feminists, all of the work that they did, it was centered on those three things. Again, that's the first wave, and it started in the 19th century. Historical dates are malleable, but they mark the end of the first wave at 1920 in this country, because what happened in 1920?
Depression.
First World War.
Well, 1920? Women got the right to vote? Yeah, just in 1920. So all of the work that the first wave feminists did culminated in the right to vote secured to women. 1920, that ended the first wave. So the second wave then didn't begin immediately, because in 1944-ish to 1948, what was happening? There was a world war, right? And people weren't, it was still top of mind, I'm sure, to women, but there were just other things going on in the culture that necessitated the attention. So between 1920 and 1948, high level, dates are malleable, you didn't really hear too much in America from the feminist movement. But after the war ended, that ushered in the second wave feminists. So we're talking about 1949 and beyond. Now, the second wave of feminists, the way that they operated was quite different than the first wave, because there are certain things happening in America around that time frame, right? So you had the flappers, the roaring flappers of the 20. You had your those movements where they were burning bras and they were really looking for sexual liberation, all of those sorts of things. We've heard those things before. We had Hugh Hefner. Died a few years ago, but he came up right in that area where he was talking about sexual liberation and those sorts of things. So that's the context, that's the social context against which the second wave feminists really began to do their work here in, that's fine.
You missed my introduction.
So then, that then is the context against which the second wave feminists really came to bear in this country. So the second wave feminists, they were concerned about securing sexual equality between men and women. They were concerned about just the social mores and the cultural norms that were evident for men. That's what they were going towards in the second wave. And of course, a lot of those things, they manifested sexually in that time. If you think about Roe v. Wade, that was legalized in 1973, but before 1973, there were huge discussions going on about sexual activity and the tethering of that to marriage. And so when the marital bonds in 1969 is when divorce became legal in this country. So 69, divorce became legal, and in 73, Roe v. Wade was passed. So you can see how the tethering of sexual activities to the dissolution of marriage happened in the context of the second wave. Right? Does that make sense?
Did some of the, I think during World War II in America, to help manufacture a lot of the war machine, they had women involved in factories, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they volunteered to kind of go in and help, and there was the posters of, I forget what her name was, But was that kind of a start too, where they're saying we can kind of go in and do the guy's job?
That was exactly it, because during the World War, largely speaking, all the men left, right? And so the women went into, they were the ones who were working. So when the war ended, the question was like, what do we do with the women? Because they've been working this whole time. So that spurred the second wave as well. So now you have women who gained their independence and their liberties because of the war, and it just happened to be at the very same time when the sexual revolution was happening and they were trying to push the limits of culture. All of those things happened at the very same time. And so that made feminism, it looked quite different in the 1940s, 50s, 60s than it did in the 1800s. They just weren't thinking about those sorts of things. So that was the second wave. Now, you know, an argument can be made that we're still in the second wave, but there is a third wave of feminism as well. And the third wave of feminism, it really just represents in-house fighting, if you will, between the second wave and the third wave. So has anyone heard of third wave? That's probably what you'll think of when you think about angry feminists and that type of thing. But the third wave feminists, they emerged because they recognized that there were concerns that the second wave feminists, they weren't addressing in the feminist movement. If the feminist movement was a movement for women, generally speaking, the third wave feminists said that the second wave was not paying attention to the experiences of certain women in this country. So we spoke before about when this was happening, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 40s. There were civil rights issues going on in this country, right? So there were Black women in this country who not only didn't have equality with men generally, they didn't have equality with in the eyes of white people, right? So the third wave feminists were very critical of the second wave feminists for not paying attention to the concerns of all women and not, generally speaking, just white upper class middle women. So that the third wave wave still exists, but more so today it is a distinction between feminism in, say, a first world country versus feminism in a third world country. So the experiences of women in Pakistan are quite different than the experiences of women in this country. And so the third wave feminists would criticize American feminists for seemingly not being concerned about what's happening to women in those other countries. So the third wave feminism is always going to critique the second waves of feminists for their short-sightedness. Okay? So those are roughly the three waves of feminism. So I asked before what you all think when you think about the word feminism. Broadly speaking, feminism is a social and cultural movement that began in the 19th century that sought to secure equal rights for women based on equality of the sexes. Is there anyone here who has a problem with that first definition? Anyone who does have a problem with it or concerns? Good, because if someone raised their hand, it would have been a terrible situation. Okay, so one of the reasons why I think the church is hesitant to speak about feminism is because they don't necessarily grant that there are a couple of definitions that are running around the culture, right? So this first definition, the social and cultural movement that's based on the idea that the sexes are equal, that's okay for us as Christians, right? Because even if we want to be biblical about it and go to Genesis 1, it seems to be the case that God made man and woman equally in the image and likeness of God, right? So there's a certain sense in which we shouldn't have a problem with this first definition. We actually shouldn't have a problem with acknowledging this idea that historically women have not been treated equally. That's okay to admit, right? But it doesn't mean that we're affirming the second and the more narrower definition. So as definitions go, over time, definitions change and they become much more systemic and they begin to talk about things that were not even in the original definition, right? So now the type of feminism that we're dealing with is the systematic oppression of women through male-dominated systems of power. Religion, they say, is one of those male-dominated systems of power. Therefore, Christianity is oppressive to women. You understand the logic? So what they're going to say is that there are certain social institutions that exist that have been created by men. In some instances, you'll hear feminists say that marriage is an oppressive social institution. They'll talk about motherhood being an oppressive social institution. So they really make this definition more systemic to include all of the systems that we see in society, which I don't think is a legitimate way of understanding or even working through the issues that are real and apparent. So let's talk about starting points, because even before we get to the real meat of feminism, I want to park here and do some philosophy for a minute. So the feminist starting point is the denial of human nature as a real reality, a real thing. They deny that human nature is a real thing. So when Adam was here last week and he was talking about truth, and he probably said something like truth is correspondent to reality. Whatever is in the world, really, you can say something about it and your statement's going to be true. If something's in the world and your statement doesn't accord with it, you have said something that is false. So when I say that they deny human nature as a real reality, they just don't think that human nature exists in the real world, okay? For them, what it means to be human is to be a social construction. Your ideas, your feelings, your experiences, anything other than reality, right? And so you can see that this doesn't just stop at the feminist movement. It goes to the transgender movement. It goes to the LGBTQIAP, whatever movement.
The alphabet movement?
There's more letters. It's seminal. But that's the starting point for all of these things, is a denial of reality. So as Christians, we have to be concerned about tethering our ideas and thoughts to reality. The conversation is lost when you give up this idea that reality is real. And that even applies to our theology. Our acceptance of the truth that God exists is not just a mental construction, right? We think that he really exists in reality. So when people say that God does not exist, they're thinking that they're saying something true, but it's false, because he really does exist in reality. So this whole idea of reality and the necessity of truth is it applies in this situation, but it's just, in order to be human, you have to deal with these sorts of things, right? So it almost sheds light on the fact that people who don't live in reality, they live in irrationality, right? And that's just a psychological truth. I'm just saying, from a psychological perspective, there are certain disorders, when you don't live according to reality, that's an abnormality, psychologically speaking. And so spiritually speaking and theologically speaking, there's a lot of people walking around in abnormality and dysfunction because they're removing truth from their ability, reality from their ability to speak about truth. Okay. So philosophically, there's a couple of ways to define and or understand certain things. Have you all seen these pictures before? Okay, good. Okay, so in the top left-hand corner is a spoon. A spoon is only a spoon because it does what spoons do. It helps you eat soup well, right? If you have something in your hand and it's not helping you eat soup well, we're gonna say, like, that's a bad spoon. Or maybe it's a piece of metal at the very worst. What a spoon is functionally tied to what it does. What a thing is and its worth, it comes from the function that it serves. If it doesn't serve that function, or if it doesn't behave a certain way, then it has no value to us, because it only exists to be a functionally useful thing. That's one way of defining something. Another way of defining something is essentially, a thing is what it is. That's it. Essentially, a thing is what it is. Worth comes from what it is. Behavior doesn't affect what it is. Feelings don't affect what it is. It's all about what it is. So a dog. A dog is a dog because it has a canine nature, not because it barks, or not because it chases after cats, or not because it does all of the things that dogs do. If a dog never barked, if it never chased cats, if it never did the things that dogs do, it would still be a dog, because what it is directed by its canine nature. The same thing with a cat. If a cat never did the cat things that cats do, it'd still be a cat. In the abortion debate, it's still a human just because it can't do things on its own. Just because it doesn't have certain abilities doesn't mean it's not human, because what it is what it is. Its nature directs what it is. So you can see that outside of accepting this distinction between functionality and essential definitions, you can see where we're going in this whole debate, right? So for feminists, for transgenders, for LGBTQ and the rest, what they're gonna say is that a thing isn't what it is by virtue of its nature. It's what it is because of what it feels, or how it behaves, or how it dresses, or how it acts. Those sorts of things. We've heard those things before. Those are fundamentally philosophical distinctions that people are making, perhaps without even knowing that they're making those distinctions. So, I switched slides because I want to ask you another question. Let's talk about sex and gender for a minute. What is sex as distinct from gender? We'll start with sex. What is that?
It's the more specific nature of the human, I would presume.
More specific nature of a human being? Okay, yeah. What's gender? Same thing. Specific. It's tied to one's nature? Okay. Yeah, that's true. That's true, definitely. So sex is a biological category. You know, it's your genes, your hormones, your external and internal genitalia, all of the things that distinct you from another type of human being, if you will, right? Gender is a social category that's dependent on the biological category. So when you speak to people in the culture, they stop right here. And what they tell you is that gender is a social category, and they just period after that. That's incorrect. It is a social category, but it doesn't exist on its own. It's tied, it's tethered, it's metaphysically dependent on the biological category. Gender, learned characteristics, personality traits, behavioral patterns, etc. Those are all social observations that are tied to biology. Okay, so you never want to be, you always want to be aware of the assumptions that people are bringing to the discussion. So a lot of times when people are talking about gender, they're untethering those two, but I'll explain to you why you can't untether those two things. Suppose we had, say, rose-colored glasses on, or glasses that made everything blue. Okay, so we had those glasses on, and as a result of that, all that we see in the world is blue, right? Blue chairs, blue people, blue purses, blue shirts. All you saw in the world was blue. Do you think that that world would have other colors?
If you wore the blue glasses, no. Because your perspective's wrong.
Yeah. If everything in the world is blue, the sun is blue, the sky is blue, it's already blue, but the trees are blue, the grass is blue, dogs are blue, everything in the world is blue, there would be no room for us to have a word for red. Right? Because everything in reality is blue. Colors necessitate distinction, right? So we have red because we understand that blue isn't red, it's something else. Of course, colors are, wavelengths and frequencies and those sorts of things. We're not talking about it from that perspective. But just as social beings, we have red and we have yellow and we have green and we have all of the other colors because we understand that they're not the same things. So that when I take a look at this chair and I say that it's red, you all have a right to say it's not red, it's blue, right? Because you know what red is, and this is not red. If all we had in this world were males, men, big men, small men, skinny men, fat men, whatever, pick your type of man. If all we had in the world were men, would we need to have a word woman? We wouldn't. Why would we, right?
It wouldn't exist.
It wouldn't exist because everything is a man. And the words that we use are only symbols for reality, right? So if everything in reality is a man, there's no need to have the word woman, right? So the fact that we have a word called woman, it assumes that women and men are different, right? And that is the error that feminists, I'm not going to say all three of them, but that's the error that they all make, because they assume that what it means to be male or female is just feelings and behaviors and conduct. But even their use of the word woman, it doesn't accord with their own worldview.
Is that partly why they're starting to change literature to get rid of the gender pronouns and things?
Yeah, they have to. But it's so interesting. So whenever you have systems that are based on logical absurdities, you're going to see it. You're going to see it blowing up on itself, right? So, for example, Bruce Jenner. We all know Bruce Jenner, right? And it's quite interesting because even before we started talking about this, Bruce hadn't gone through his transition yet. So it's quite interesting to see all of the things that are still relevant in light of his transition. So, but when he was making his transition, what's the first thing that, well, not me, I won't say that. When Bruce was making his transition, he did some very clear things. He started dressing in dresses, right? He stopped wearing pants. He grew his hair out, right? And he started wearing makeup. He got a nose job and all those. Don't those actions assume that what it means to be a woman is something real? Because if it wasn't real, why such the change? You could have continued with your hair the same length. You could have not bought a whole new wardrobe to look like your stepdaughter. You could have done all of the things that you were doing before and still maintained that you were no longer a male. But the fact that you did it, it assumes that you understand that there are two genders in the world. You just don't want to be the one that you are, right? So it's interesting how these things play out when you carry it to its logical conclusion, because those are the same individuals that will say that what it means to be a female is a state of mind. If it's a state of mind, again, why did you grow your hair out, right? And those discussions always, they ought to happen in grace, because we're Christians, always happen in grace. But these are the sorts of things that what it means to be a follower of God, what it means to be committed to the truth, is the ability to recognize something that isn't true and gently let others know that that's not true. Okay. Questions, comments?
I had a ministry out at the homeless shelter, and one of the very first people we mentored was a 65-year-old transgender. It's a man who believed he was a woman, and also believed in God, and really believed that what he was doing was correct. And he would read literature that from pastors, I guess, who done the same things,
Okay.
transitioned and said it was okay. So I guess it's more of a commentary. And I also mentored a young man where his sister also transitioned. So it's very prevalent, and what's really surprising is the lack of approach. And I think maybe there's not enough of an awareness of how to approach these situations.
Yeah.
I mean, it's relatively brand new.
Yeah.
But it's an easy category or subject to get very defensive and hostile and not have proper footing.
Yeah, it is. I think that's true for a lot of things, just because it's not ever easy to articulate truth to people who don't want to accept it. So I think that's why
Blue glasses.
who have on blue. How do you?
Talk to somebody with
Yeah.
blue glasses.
Yeah, how do you convince someone that the tree is green? And so and this is not easy, but it's the task of getting people to take off their glasses. That's what's hard. It's the task of getting people to realize you are a sinner in need of a savior. That's a task. It's a task getting people to realize that the New Age movement is not going to get you to God. That's the task. But it's the task that we're all called to. And evangelism, in any context of the word, it's not a simple. That's why we have the Holy Spirit to help in our time of need. And sometimes the discussions that we have, they're not aimed towards changing the person right then and right there. Some discussions are just about planting seeds, and other discussions are just about watering, because ultimately God is going to give the increase. But a lot of times we're not doing the planting, and a lot of times we're not recognizing when something needs to be watered or even trimmed.
To that point, so I had a gentleman who joined me in mentoring this man, and his approach, he couldn't take it, but for a couple of meetings, and his approach was just to back away in a more of a standoff approach. I continued to meet with this person, but it was also very difficult. So I guess in your approach, and if you're ever in that situation, evangelizing and trying to, I would encourage you to check your heart and not be so standoffish.
Yeah, and has anyone heard of Rosaria Butterfield? Okay, Rosaria Butterfield. This is just an example of what you're saying. Rosaria Butterfield, she's now a believer in Christ, but for most of her, up until I would want to say her 30s or so, she was a lesbian. What happened to her, what started her process, her conversion process, was she had a neighbor, they were Christians, and they just ended up inviting her to dinner, knowing where she stood and what she believed in, but they invited her over for fellowship. See, Acts, when we read in Acts, the believers got together to fellowship and they broke bread to one another. That's just not, it's not just in the text because it's a cute thing. Like, there's something about fellowshipping with other people that brings them and draws them to Christ. Because if you think about the Trinity, the Father is in relationship with the Son's in relationship with the Spirit, the Father's in relationship. There's a fellowship within the Trinity that the body of Christ ought to be exemplifying as well. And that's what draws people. So this type of evangelism that's abrasive, this type of evangelism that turns people off, I don't necessarily know that that's what we're supposed to be doing. And even when you look in the New Testament, Jesus lived the type of life that people would come to him, right? Jesus didn't break himself into Matthew's house and say, give me something to eat, right? He was invited over, right? So there's something about being a believer and living the life of a Christian that invites this process of the Holy Spirit working. And sometimes that just happens over Chick-fil-A. Sometimes it doesn't, but that's part of the wisdom as well, as to knowing the difference between those sorts of situations.
I have a question. Something you said about what the feminists believe now. It got me really messed up.
Okay.
They don't believe, like, it was sort of like they don't believe in being a woman. It's kind of the way I took it.
Some do. So there are different grades of feminism, and some are not as bad as others as far as comparison between the two. But as compared to, say, what the Bible is going to teach, then they're all in the same camp, if you will. So some forms of feminism hate men, want to sock it to men. But not all feminists want to sock it to men. Just some of them want it. There are some feminists that want to get rid of marriage. because it's oppressive. Not all feminists, though. There are some feminists that uphold the distinctions between the two, but they maybe say we need to change some things in the Bible because it's kind of misogynistic. So there are some words that we need to, they still love God, and they're way better than the hate men group. But but there's still something about, so there are gradations of feminism, and I think that it's for us not to lump all of them together. We lump them all together insofar as they don't hit the truth of Christianity. But I think it's okay to affirm some things. So C.S. Lewis said this about religion. C.S. Lewis said that as Christians, we don't have to say or affirm or believe that all religions are false. We just have to be able to say that they're false at the points that they contradict Christianity, right? So it's okay to affirm some things about feminism, third wave feminism. When did you see a group of feminists from America go to Saudi Arabia and picket? They don't do that, right? So we can affirm the shortcomings of second wave feminism as identified by the third wave feminism. And that's okay as Christians, because there's going to be some true things. Nothing is wrong through and through, but it's just kind of for us to make the distinctions in the seriousness, if you will, of certain ideas. Does that kind of answer?
Yeah, I think so.
So where feminism contradicts the Bible, is where it becomes wrong.
Where feminism contradicts the Bible and where it contradicts Christ.
Okay.
The measuring stick is not ever other Christians. That's a terrible thing. So what we're going to say about feminism is always going to find its ground in the Word and in Jesus, because many who have professed to be Christians have hated women. Can't deny that. Many who have professed to be Christians treated blacks poorly. We can't deny that. But we go to the Word and we go to Jesus to make those distinctions. And the hope is that those who call themselves Christians are worthy of the calling that they've been called with, but some don't. And so when we were, Nora and I, when we were going to go to the school that evening, one of the things that we would have made very clear is that we were there not to discuss, do Christians oppress women? I have nothing to say to that. Okay, you win the debate, yeah, because Christians have and do oppress women. The question is, does Christianity oppress women? Those are two separate questions. Okay, so, any more comments? So gender and sex are two different categories. That's what the movements, umbrella term, that's what the movements are going to say, that they're two different categories. The feminist movement, transgender, LGBTQ, all of them say that gender and sex are two different things. That's not what we say. We're going to say that gender and sex are two sides of the same coin. So it's not two separate coins, two sides of the same coin.
Aren't there like feminists who will say that the whole transgender movement is an affront to the feminist movement?
Yeah, that's how it's
So
imploding on itself.
Right.
Yeah, that's how it's imploding on itself, because the homosexual movement, transgender, LGBTQ, all of those sorts of movements, they were a result of the feminist movement, right? They only exist today because the feminists, they knocked down some hurdles for them. So the first task was for them, the feminists, to deny this idea that men and women are different, that they're the same. But once you grant that, anything's open. And so that's why those other movements could take their shape and take their form in society. It's quite interesting how it implodes. So just a quick example, as I think I mentioned that I'm from Canada. Did I mention that I'm Canadian?
Yes.
Okay, so there was in the news a few years ago now, there was in the news this story about homeless shelters for women. 2 women had to leave the homeless shelter because the homeless shelter allowed transgender women to come in, and the women, they didn't feel comfortable because it was a shelter that didn't have any men, right? So they came from situations, abusive situations, where they had to leave the house and those sorts of things, and they went to that shelter for protection. Then come these two men who think that they're women, and they make the women feel uncomfortable, and so the women have to leave the homeless shelter. How does that work, right? So this whole idea of oppression and patriarchy, we're going to talk about patriarchy, but it's still the case that in the feminist issues such as the one that I've brought up, it's still the case that they are allowing men to dictate to them what they ought to do, or forcing them to do. So with the whole bathroom bill here in Charlotte, you all remember the bathroom bill? Okay. So it was so interesting to me how men who thought they were women were telling women what they should be comfortable with.
Exactly.
And it was interesting to me that men who thought they were women were trying to use women's washrooms, but women who thought they were men weren't speaking. Right? So if you are a woman and you transition to being a man, and you can pass in society, pass in society, you're just gonna go use the male's washroom. But if you are a woman who transitions to a male and you still kind of look like a male, you're probably not going to want to use the male's washroom because it's a safety issue for you at that point, right? If you're a woman and you're in the male's washrooms and the man sees you and you apparently are a woman who's trying to pass as a man, I don't think that that's going to go too well in the washroom. But for some reason, that wasn't the voice that was heard. It was the men, biological men, who are trying to tell women what they should be comfortable with. That's when feminism implodes on itself, because it's supposed to be something that empowers women, but they're still being regulated, if you will, or dictated to, if you will, by men. It just happens to be the case that that's true because they have untethered this, what I'm saying, this essential thing between reality and truth and what is. It implodes on itself. Every movement is going to implode on itself. In the abortion movement, Roe v. Wade, you all know what abortion is. Has it ever struck you as interesting that if a pregnant woman is murdered, it's double homicide? But I thought that it wasn't a person, right? So there's this irrationality that accompanies just because of the way truth works. There's this irrationality that accompanies untruths at some level. Okay, so let's move from that. It's, how much time do I have?
8.
Till 8 o'clock, okay. So let's table that for a minute, the philosophical discussion that we're having. Does anyone have any questions, comments, concerns, disagreements with what's been said so far? Okay, so now let's talk about the dreaded P word. Okay, what is patriarchy? In your understanding, what is patriarchy? What do you think of when you think about patriarchy?
Man's world.
Man's world? Okay.
I guess man rules, makes the laws, makes sort of governs over.
Okay.
Father.
Father?
Sorry, we're talking matriarchy or patriarchy?
No, I don't want y'all to cheat.
Oh, gotcha.
So.
I lost it for a second.
So with your definition, men's rule, men's governance, is that inherently oppressive?
No.
Okay. Okay, that's good. See, these things, these questions that I'm asking you, it'd be completely off for me if you all answered in different ways. So I appreciate that. Okay, so right. So the fact that you have rulership and the fact that you have power and the fact that you have ability is not inherently oppressive. That's what we're going to say, right? Okay. What else do you think about when you think about patriarchy?
Like she said about Father and God is our father. That's what I think.
Okay.
I mean, they called Moses and,
The patriarch.
he was patriarch.
Yep.
And then, of course, like Washington and all the founding fathers
Yeah, the
for
patriarchs.
the country.
Okay, so let me say something about patriarchy. Literally, I'm talking about, like, etymologically, the word patriarchy, pater and archy, literally means rule of the fathers. Patriarchy does not mean literally rule of men. And that's a huge distinction, because when you're listening to the culture and you're listening to society, they'll say things like patriarchy is the rule of men over women and it has to be overthrown. That's maybe what it has become, but that's actually not what the word means. Rule of fathers is a very different thing than rule of men. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they ruled their families. They ruled Israel, if you will, right? Doesn't mean that all men ruled all women in Israel. It just means that there was a patriarch that was responsible for the nation. That's different. It's the organization of society wherein the fundamental social unit is the family that's headed by its father. Okay, that's distinct from, let me make some distinctions between patriarchy and some other ways that rulership can happen in society. So patriarchy as distinct from matriarchy. Matriarchy then obviously would mean the rule of mothers, right? So a lot of feminists, the feminist movement, they used to talk about this idea. I remember this when I was in university. They used to talk about matriarchies and how women are powerful and they used to rule the whole world until men came onto the scene, et cetera, and now we have the patriarchal oppressive system. So they used to talk about this idea that there were matriarchies before white men came to power, is basically what they'll say. However, universities don't talk about matriarchy anymore. You want to know why? Because it's never been found.
Right, it's not true.
Right? There has not, anthropologically, sociologically, there have never been matriarchies in human societies. There's been what we want to say are matrilocal societies, matrifocal societies, and matrilineal societies. And we can talk about what those things are. If you want the definitions, I'll give them to you. But all those things, they're not the same thing as matriarchal societies where the fundamental unit of the social structure is the mother that heads the family and ergo the society. That's never existed. But to listening to feminists say, you think that number one, the matriarchy was wiped out, or number two, a matriarchy is coming. It's never happened. Because there's something about patriarchy that we want to hold on to, right? So there is what I distinct between sociological patriarchy and biblical patriarchy. We can affirm biblical patriarchy and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the patriarchs. We can affirm that. We ought to affirm certain scriptures in the New Testament as upholding and teaching biblical patriarchy, but that's not what people are talking about today. When they're talking about patriarchy, they're usually just talking about sociological patriarchy. So sociological patriarchy is this idea that, and it was in our definition before, sociological patriarchy is this idea that social institutions have been made by men to be uniquely advantageous to men, right? It's this idea that women, by virtue of men making all the systems, are automatically an oppressed class, and that these women then have the right and ability to overthrow the ruling class and claim their power. And that sounds very Marxist, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm sure you all are aware of what's going on in the university today and the resurgence of Karl Marx's ideology. So politically, there's a resurgence of communists here in this country, young communists who have no idea what communism is, right? There's this resurgence of feminism in this context where they are adhering to certain Marxist ideas and philosophies that have never worked. They've always just been theories, right? So it's this idea of the ruling class and the oppressed class, and the oppressed class coming together to overthrow the ruling class and sock it to them. That was Karl Marx. So there's a certain sense in which certain forms of feminism, not all feminists, but certain forms of feminism, they hover on sociological patriarchy and or Marxism. So the question before us is whether the Bible teaches sociological patriarchy. And if it doesn't, what sort of patriarchy does it teach? Why have human societies never organized themselves in a matriarchal type system spontaneously, right? There are some countries in the world where mothers have had to take positions of rulership, but not by default, but by circumstances, right? So say in Russia, that is very much dominated by mothers and by women. It's because in all of Russia's histories, a lot of the men, just simply speaking, not getting into everything, but simply speaking, a lot of the men were not able to do what they were supposed to do because they became addicted to substances and those sorts of things, and they couldn't take their rightful position. So in that type of situation, the mothers and such, they come and they fill the spots of men, but that doesn't mean that that happened spontaneously. Something caused that to be. And all I'm just saying is that patriarchy has always happened anthropologically in all human societies, has happened spontaneously. People have always organized themselves in a patriarchal type of way, but that's distinct from the other sorts of organizations that you'll find. Okay, so there are certain tribes, say in Africa, certain tribes in Southeast Asia and those sorts of things, certain tribes of people where those who are ruling, they are mothers, they are the women. That's still not matriarchy, because when you look at the organization of those cultures socially and politically, men are still ruling. It just happens to be the case that in a certain context, women are doing jobs that they wouldn't necessarily do over here. So patriarchy and matriarchy are the distinctions, not the matrifocal or the matrilineal and those other things that we were talking about. Anthropologists, they'll say now that what they thought were matriarchal societies were really matrilineal societies, not true matriarchies, that type of thing. But again, the definitions that people use, they change the definitions to suit their purposes. So sometimes feminists will truly be talking about matrilineal societies, but say that we found a matriarchy. That's not true. Matrilineal is tracing the line of descent through the mother, not through the father. So Abraham begot Isaac, begot Jacob. In a matrilineal system, it would be Sarah begat so-and-so. Okay, so that's matrilineal. Matrilocal is when two people get married and the husband moves in with the wife's family, as opposed to traditionally the woman leaves and goes to live with the father.
It's from the Native American way. Native Americans do that a lot.
Yeah.
Certain tribes.
Yeah, certain tribes, yeah. And then matrilineal, matrifocal, and actually what I just said was matrilocal. Matrifocal is where the women are the head of the household, primarily the heads of their households. But they're not necessarily the heads of the society, the community. They're certainly not heads of the political organization, even in that context.
Would that be like a single mother? Or would there be a man?
Well, it kind of depends. So my background is West Indian, and in West Indian cultures, for the most part, the women are the ones who run the house for different reasons. won't get into. But for the most part, women are the ones who run the household. That doesn't necessarily mean that Jamaica, which is where I'm from, is a matriarchal society. It just means that the women are doing things in the houses that the men aren't doing. And today, even in our society, Western society, where women are having those positions, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're living in a matriarchy, but it is the case that for the most part, women are doing those sorts of things because men aren't doing it.
Are we talking about something outside the norm for the woman to do?
Yeah, it's born out of necessity, right? So in a family context where there's a marriage, and for whatever reason, the father leaves, that means that the mother has to step up and do that, right? So all over our culture, I think it's very clear to see that that's what's happening all over the culture. The only distinction that I'm making is that that's not happening spontaneously.
Right.
It's being driven by other things.
Right.
And I'll say too that in that context and in that situation, she has to do that. What is she gonna do? Right? She has to do that. But that's why the New Testament says that there's almost nothing worse than a father who doesn't take care of his household.
Right.
That's why it says that.
And take care of the orphans and widows.
And the
Because
orphans and the widows.
Yeah.
That's what was supposed to, in a well-functioning society, that's what's supposed to happen, right?
Because his very nature is to do that, and he's not doing it, which is horrible.
I mean, God is our Father, right?
He's the ultimate example of what a man is supposed to be to his family.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, he created men and women, he created specific
He gets some.
roles and drive and desires in each of them to perform.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when we get, and we'll maybe go to some of the scripture verses if we have time. So I always like to say that the roles and the responsibilities and what's supposed to be done, it has nothing to do with washing dishes and cooking. So in our society, when we talk about the roles and some those sorts of things, inevitably those on the other side, they say something like, well, a man can wash dishes as well as women, which I wash dishes better than my husband.
Amen.
I'll tell you that. But that's not what the Bible is talking about. So what it is to be a woman is just not what it is to be a man. Yeah, both were made in the image and in the likeness of God.
So when I talk about the attack on men, especially when there seems to be a movement not only for men to be removed from the roles, but for the absence of husbands and fathers society, right? We talk about abortion and how it's a woman's right, and a father has no say, a man has no say, and how it's really just driven to divide the family.
Yeah.
And it's not so much maybe it is a man thing, but it's really more of a family thing, I guess.
It's a family thing and it's a devil thing. Yeah, that, I mean, how do you dismantle a society, take out the men?
He destroys a family unit.
Yeah.
God ordained.
Yeah.
And it destroys the whole fabric of society, and which is what we see today in America.
That's what we're seeing today. So even when I was speaking about the second wave of feminism and the things that were happening, say, in the 60s and 70s to propel the second wave forward, so many things were happening. So we were speaking about, culturally, the sexual things and Roe v. Wade and those sorts of things. Maritally, certain things were happening. But that was also when the prison industrial complex became quite a thing here, right? And prisons became privatized, where you could make money in prisons, right? So there was a driving force to ensure that there was always a customer, right? So that's when certain laws and things were changed in this country that among other things that really fed this idea that if you can take the man out of the home, then you leave the man's out of the home, but then what happens to the family, right? So even today, a lot of times with the incarceration rates and those sorts of things here, it's not just the fact that there's a lot of people in prison, it's the fact that there's a lot of people that don't have fathers at home. And what does that do? So this is kind of all devilish, right? Like it happens and it plays out in society, but at the end of the day, these things are set in motion by an enemy who wants to separate us from the Father.
Positive thing. I worked for a short time at the Health Pregnancy Center.
Okay, yeah.
And they have a man ministering to the fathers. The ladies can go there and get help, and they can get an ultrasound. If they don't know, then Brad, the minister there, will talk to the fathers and help them through that.
That's awesome. That's what's necessary.
Yeah. So.
That's what's necessary. And what's also, I'm saying devilish, but what also is quite diabolical is just this idea that the feminist movement and the other movements have put forth that men are not necessary for anything other than the procreative act.
Yep.
And in some instances, they're not even necessary for that. Because we have like banks and stuff.
Right.
Right?
Well, you had to get it from somebody.
Yeah, but there's
Yeah.
one that can father millions, perhaps, right?
Yeah.
So it's just this driving idea to remove men from the fabric of society. And sometimes when you're speaking to feminists and such that are of the hate men type of feminists, they don't understand like these sorts of things. Even in the context of family, the best thing for society is that children are being raised by the people who created them, not the government.
Right.
You can have a government do it, like they can do it, but does the government do anything well?
Nope.
No. Right? So those are the sorts of things that they impact the culture, these sorts of things, politically, culturally, morally, ethically, they impact the culture, and we can see and we know what it feels like because we're here. Yes.
So one of the ways I see this play out is at the company I work, which I'll leave unnamed,
Sure.
since I'm being recorded over here.
It's on tape.
And so at the company I work at, they've got a goal. It's a stated goal. By 2038, we're supposed to have 50% of the workforce be women. Okay. Now in the company I work at, most of the folks are engineers, IT, and it's very hard when you put a new job requisition out there and you get resumes that come in. 80% of the resumes you get are from men,
Yeah.
but there's this increased pressure, so much so that we did our annual conference. And when we did our annual conference this year, so just a group of us go off-site and we talk, and they bring all these guest speakers in. The overriding theme, it was all about women empowerment. That was the theme every single day, to the point when we got to the end of the workshops, some of us guys got together and we said, we feel like this male guilt. Like we felt really guilty at the end for being a man, because they just were pressing on you that we are not doing enough to raise women up. And the truth is nobody I know ever oppresses women in the workplace. We're happy to any of them to bring them on teams.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that we don't see the interest there when we put the applications or the job requisitions out. So but we're seeing HR at a corporate level really driving this heavy movement of feminism, as well as there's a lot of diversity training and things.
Mm-hmm. And that's what happens when business caves to the culture and to the politics, right? So in that scenario, 50% men, 50% women. At some point in time, just because men and women do different things, we can talk about neurochemistry if you want to do that. We can talk about how the brain functions in men and women if you do. But 50%, a goal of 50% means that number one, you're going to not pay attention to all of the male applications at some point. Number two, you're going to bring women into there who maybe don't have the same qualifications, but just because they're women, they're there, right? So I say all the time, because I didn't vote in the country, I'm Canadian. So I say all the time that was very interesting during the last election, that one of Hillary's platforms was vote for me because I'm a woman. Did you all notice that? Like, it's time to have a woman and all. And so in my head, I was thinking, what does having 2X chromosomes say about your ability to lead? They don't say anything about your ability to lead, but there's this idea that the act of being something means you are intrinsically qualified to do that thing. And that's a caving to the social pressures and ideas that are going on.
In a way, that's sort of the opposite, though, because they're trying to say, like, what it means to be feminine isn't really have to do with your biological chromosomes.
Yeah, it has nothing to do
But
with
yet
it.
she uses that as though that is the very thing that should make me electable.
Yeah,
So
that's
they're
the
kind of conflicted.
illogical, it's
Yeah.
always gonna conflict. Illogical systems, i.e. systems that are not based on truth, are always gonna conflict at some level.
And I see a lot of that when I work in multiple different companies, I'm an independent. So I see companies, a lot of them that are struggling to maintain or get to that goal. And the feedback I hear back from them is this, well, okay, so are you gonna modify our quotas? Are you gonna modify the production to accommodate them? No, you should not. They have to perform at the same level. Well, but they can't do that physically.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's been this, I hear a lot from the companies I go into where they're disgruntled employees because sometimes the women are carrying more of a load because they do a better skill at the job, or the men are carrying more of a load, and you're getting a divided work environment.
Yeah.
More so than you were
It
cohesive.
starts to feel unnatural.
Because it's going to be like the fire department was, where some firemen come back and sue. I mean, some years ago, some white officers in Charlotte sued the fire department because they get promoted because of their color. Because the quota said they had to have so many minorities, they didn't get promoted because of color, because they're white. So they sued in a reverse discrimination act.
Did they win?
They won.
See, this
And then
is,
it was sealed.
and then,
Yeah, but I mean, there's a lot of that I see, because I go into different businesses and I talk with the management and the facility managers about what they're having a hard time, like you said, finding that fulfillment to get that goal, but then they can't find the quality they need to keep up production.
and the other thing that I find interesting is this for all industries or for certain industries? Because there are some industries just by nature of the job that are male dominated, right? So you don't really, has anyone in their life ever seen a female garbage person? Okay, so do perhaps the men who work there, should there be a 50% quota where all of our garbage people need to be women?
There's a construction company that I've met with in Charlotte that is trying to get women construction workers.
That's right, yeah.
And it's very hard. But the upper ownership is pushing it and demanding it out of their people that you find them, and they can't find them.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to do it.
Yeah. And see, that's what happens just by default. So without government intervention and without policies and those sorts of things, men and women organize themselves in different ways. There wasn't a council in all human societies of the world. There was not a council of people that decided we're going to be a patriarchal society. It just happened to be that way. In all of human societies, men and women have always distincted themselves by dressing differently, right? Some cultures, women wear dresses, and maybe other cultures they don't wear dresses. In some cultures, men wear certain, but there were always differences because we've always acknowledged differences. And acknowledging the differences, there's certain things about how women are constructed by God to operate in certain ways and to tend towards certain things. So I'm talking about like the bell curve, right? So in any bell curve, the majority of people are always going to fall in the middle. There's always going to be extremes. But generally speaking, women organize themselves different ways because of their womanness, which is not a word, but I think it captures what I'm trying to say.
We'll let you fly with that.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Don't hold it to me. So women have always organized themselves in certain ways.
Yes.
Men have always organized themselves in certain ways. That's why we don't see a lot of people who are female garbage persons. We don't see a lot of and this has nothing to do with ability. I'm always going to say that. It has nothing to do with ability. It has to do with the way that you organize yourselves, uncoerced by any other thing. Men and women act in certain ways, and the culture is trying to get rid of the bell and put us all under the same distribution, and it doesn't work.
Nope.
It's imploding.
It's not our nature.
It's not in our nature.
But
We're
women
both.
don't have the physical stamina that men do.
We're
And a lot
different.
of these jobs require that. And a lot of women are smart enough to know they don't need those jobs.
Mhm. We're different, and I think, I mean, so we can acknowledge that it has nothing to do with intellect, right? So, my husband's not here and I'm on tape, but I just want to say that I'm just better at certain things and he's just better at certain things, right? So the way that and I'm sure he's not a unique person, the way that my husband is built, like if he's watching TV, you can't talk to him because he doesn't have the ability to do like 2.5 things. Yeah. Sorry, that's a little bit petty.
Well, you can talk to him, but he won't remember what you said.
Huh?
Well, he remembers what he wanted to remember. That's the thing with guys, right? So.
Oh, we're gonna get feminist.
Everybody
We got some feminists up in here today.
No, there are
Yeah,
certain
right?
things that women do by virtue of being women, and there are certain things that men do by virtue of being men, right? So, and that's not a value-laden comment. It's just a true comment, and I think it bears out in our experiences. If you live with someone who's the opposite sex of you, you know that he's not like you and you're not like him, and it becomes the basis for a lot of disagreements, right? But it's also the basis for unity and the sorts of things that God is requiring, right? That we're just not the same, and that bears out neurochemically. It bears out hormonally and psychology because we are what we are, right? We're all human, but we're not the same. And the feminist movement and the other movements and the culture is trying to convince us that we're not the same. So the question then is whether Christianity is one of those social institutions. Is Christianity one of those social institutions that inherently is oppressive to women? That's the question. It's not, but we have to be able to say why it isn't, where it isn't. So, some caveats here. So, there is no question that religion has been used as a tool of oppression. It's no question that Christians have been the tools to manifest those types of questions. But there's a difference between Christians and Christianity, right? So, you probably have heard the analogy or this example many times. There are many doctors in this world who aren't good doctors, but that doesn't mean we throw out the whole medical enterprise, right? There are many lawyers in this world, plumbers, builders, whatever the case may be. There are many people who are not good at what they do, but you don't throw out the enterprise. And the same thing is with Christianity. Christianity stands or falls on Jesus and on the Word, not on the people. And our hope is that the people are conforming to the Word and to Jesus, but that's not the measuring stick. You know, the Bible says that take care not to compare yourselves to other people, because other people just aren't the measuring stick. And so that's a lot of the sentiment that runs in the culture as well. Well, Christianity is this because this Christian did this and vice versa, but that's not the measuring stick.
Those were good questions you had on the last slide at the bottom. Or do you have time to go through them or no?
Yep, I'm going to get into them.
Oh, okay.
So, does Christianity prescriptively endorse women oppression? Does God hate women? Is God male? Is the Bible sexist? Okay, so does Christianity endorse women? Well, if I said to you that, not endorse, does Christianity oppress women? If I said to you that Christianity is oppressive to women, or someone said that to you, what are some of the things that you would maybe say?
How?
Or think?
So I could get their perspective, what kind of colored glasses they're wearing,
Yeah.
and then hit them over the head with the Bible.
I mean,
Love
you have to
you.
think that
In
because,
love, of course.
in the Bible, women should submit to men, you know, that's, I mean, is that their idea? Of how
But that is, we're gonna get into that because that's out of context.
It is, and that's a hammer that a man, not as much today, but used to use. And I grew up where, because I'm a lot older than anybody around here, where men were very condescending to women, and they did treat them more like servants. And I still see that once in a while.
Yeah.
So it depends on what kind of Christian you are, not the Christianity.
Right.
But men have been guilty of that, especially in certain denominations.
I think that's true.
But that's not reading the whole verse, right? Where it's supposed to love you, right?
Yeah, we're going to
That's
talk
not
about
loving
that.
anyone.
We're going to talk about Ephesians 5:22 and 23.
Well, if you're going to talk about it, I'll just wait and leave my comment for that time.
Okay, no problem. No problem at all.
Could you say the exact opposite though, that Christian men should treat their wives better than a man out in the workforce that is treating his secretary like a servant? I mean,
Yeah, there is a standard of behavior.
yeah, right.
Yeah, there's a standard of behavior. I think I think today that as a result of ethical standards and moral standards and truth standards being compromised, largely speaking in Christianity, we have forgotten that we're called to holiness.
Right.
It's not just a pretty saying, like literally God is calling us to love one another, and he's calling us to look to the interests of others over. He like literally said that. And so this whole idea of does Christianity oppress women comes down to those sorts of verses, because in those verses it seems to be the case that oppression is nowhere to be found. Seems to be the case. We'll talk about whether it is or not. So, does Christianity endorse women oppression? Well, let me say this, and this is something that we would have said if we had gone to the campus that night. Oppression happens. Realistically, in the world, oppression happens. Economic, political, cultural, sexual, racial, oppression happens. And it doesn't just happen under the auspices of religion. It happens under the auspices of irreligious regimes, governments, people as well. So it isn't the case that you need to have religion to be oppressive. It just seems to be the case that you have to be human, because all humans have oppressed. So this idea that you can locate oppression in religion or in Christianity specifically it's just not true. It's not historically, it's not experientially accurate. Some of the people who within our century and the century before who were quite oppressive in different ways, they weren't religious people. So it's something more than the institution. What I would have said that evening is when we're talking about oppression, we're talking about this idea that something is happening that shouldn't be happening. Something is happening and it shouldn't be happening. We have a category in Christianity called sin. But an atheist doesn't have that category. What just happens, happens. There's no morality to the way that people organize themselves in an atheist understanding. So in even speaking to that atheist and agnostic group, we were going to say, okay, we're here to talk about oppression tonight, but just so you know, your worldview doesn't even have the category.
Yeah.
Right? So we are, and what I'm saying is the basis upon which we can say, look at another person and say, you're not being a Christian. It's because we recognize that Christianity is a real thing and you're not living in correspondence. That's the basis for Jesus saying to the Pharisees, like, you're hypocrites, right? So there's just this thing about being a Christian where we're called to be a certain thing, a certain people, certain men, certain women, boys, girls. We're called to be certain people. And if we don't line up with that, we're not in the book. Temporarily, hopefully not in the book, but at the end of the day, God can't be blamed for that. It's something about human nature.
Do they say, the feminists, do they say that Christianity oppressed women? What do they use for their reason?
They use Eve because they say that the Bible blames Eve for all of humanity's problems. So Christianity is oppressive to women. They talk about the misogyny that's in the Bible, because God is never referred to as a her. That's misogynistic according to them. They say things like only males could minister as priests in the Old Testament. Like those sorts of things. They're going to pick out certain passages and say, look at this is oppressive.
Or they say that the Bible was written by men.
Yeah, that's it too.
That's another one.
But how is that oppressive by definition of the word oppressive? How are those things oppressive?
Just the fact that it is so. So by virtue of the fact that man wrote the Bible, by virtue of that fact, it's oppressive. Automatically. Yeah. By virtue of the fact that the pronoun she is not in the scriptures, the Bible is misogynistic. By virtue of the fact that there were no women priests, that means God hates women. That's their line of reasoning.
Well, speaking of that, there's a verse in Timothy that says that women should not minister or be ministers. And I mean, I can accept that. I mean, that's not a biggie for me. But it bothers me because I know, just like with Billy Graham, his daughter Ann, he will tell you that she's the best minister to anybody in the family.
Mm-hmm.
But I know, like a lot of churches, they don't have any women in pulpit. They don't have any women deacons. You know, any women in leadership really that much.
Mm-hmm.
They don't even want women to teach. So other than the children.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I really have a problem with that one.
Okay, we're going to talk about that if we have time, because one of the things that it's not in this presentation, but one of the things that I always like to speak about is the context from which the Bible is written.
Yeah,
right?
Because women were not educated in that time. And talking about them not, you know, write the Bible and that kind of thing, they weren't educated. And that would make a big difference.
Mm. And let me say this too, that, you know, when you read the word, okay, so we all know, right, the Bible wasn't written in English.
Yeah.
Nor was it written in the 21st century or the 20th or the 19th or like it was written like a long time ago. So there are certain words that we read today and we automatically assume that our understanding of that word is the understanding that Paul had.
No.
Right? So when we think of the word submit today, what automatically comes to mind?
Obey.
Obey.
I don't think of it that way.
Tell me what you think.
Well, I think of it in the way that it's meant.
Like negative, right?
No, I mean, I realize, like, I'm under him.
Oh, that's because you're a Christian. So, like, just very generally speaking, if someone says the word,
like a slavery,
yeah,
submitting.
Yeah.
the common thing that comes to, I mean, Christians correct all the time, right? So we correct for words like headship, and we correct for rulership and authority and all of those sorts of things. But to a person who doesn't correct, when they hear the word submit or authority or rule, automatically they think that the person who is submitted or ruled over is inferior.
Doesn't have control.
Doesn't have control. You're being commanded and you're being directed and you're not independent and you can't think. Like that's kind of what people think when they think of the word submit. However, what if that's not what Paul meant when he wrote the word, because he wasn't writing in the 21st century, the 20th or the 19th. He was actually Old English. So what if when he was telling women to submit, he meant something completely different? On what basis then are we able to say that the biblical text is oppressive? Maybe it's just our misunderstanding of what Paul's saying. That's what I think. That's my position, is that we don't understand what Paul meant when he was saying certain sorts of things.
Lost in translation?
Not lost in translation, lost in culture. Right? So our translation...
I mean, I'm just going to debate the obvious here. So if you're a student of the scripture,
yes,
right, and you study your Bible,
yes,
it's not a big deal to figure out what the word meant when he wrote it. You know, that's why, I mean, you can't use a 21st century dictionary. You know, you have to have tools sometimes to dig in, like for instance in the King James it used the word suffer. It doesn't mean pain and torment, it meant allow. You know, and
that's because you're a Christian.
Right.
Right, so when someone
But if you're gonna study and search for the truth,
Mhm.
you have to actually dig in to find it. You can't just read a verse and say this is what it means. No, you have to understand the Bible
Yeah.
in context.
Yeah, and perhaps, well, no, I was going to say perhaps that's why the atheists or the Gnostics didn't want to talk to us. That's not why they didn't want to talk to us. But when you're speaking to people who don't realize that you have to dig and get context, and when you're really speaking to people who think that that the Bible was written by people in the 19th century who wanted to be oppressors to women, when you are speaking to people like that, they don't automatically correct that way. So it's for us to say, well, I know this is what you mean by submit, but did you know that Paul meant something different? Therefore, what happens to your argument if submit's not part of it? I know that's what you mean when you talk about women ought to be silent, but what if the Greek doesn't even say that? Like, would that change your argument? I know what you mean when it says that fathers are to be the heads of their own households. I know what you mean, but does it interest you to know that that's not what Paul meant, right? So those are the sorts of conversations that are to be had. In-house, we can kind of talk about Ephesians and all of those sorts of things, but outside of the house, we just have to correct the understanding of the context that people are coming from.
Excuse me. But I think you have to be really careful though, because I think that's what a lot of non-Christians and liberals are doing, is saying that we don't understand the context of a lot of their liberal agenda. And they'll go back and say, you know, if you're talking about homosexuality or something, they'll say, well, that was then, but that's not what it meant now. And so you have to really navigate that very carefully and very closely to the biblical, because the world and the culture are also telling you that we are interpreting, just like where you're saying maybe you didn't interpret what Paul was saying correctly, they're saying that as their argument too, and then moving into justifying their agenda.
Yeah, I think that that's true, and it definitely happens, because I'll just say, like, in the world of apologists, sometimes we think that we know what people mean before we give them the opportunity to say that. Like, I'll say that's not a good thing to do. You always want to be in communication, and part of communication is actually listening to what someone is saying, as opposed to you thinking that you know what they're going to say before they even say that. So I definitely think that that's true. We are, for right or for wrong, we are thinking about these things in a very general way, and it would be to our disadvantage and not well of us to not give people the opportunity to say what they feel, what they think, what they believe, and those sorts of things. So I remember for a team trip, I went to Italy one year, and we were speaking to people on the campus and those sorts of things. And it really hit me when I was in Italy on campus that you speak to people named Sally and Sue and Joe and Bob. You don't speak to Roman Catholicism, right? So we had learned all of these things about Roman Catholicism, this and that, but we're speaking to someone who has their own views, their own opinions, their own experience, and their own ideas. And it's for us as Christians to give them the opportunity to say what they think, and not assume that just because I know about Roman Catholicism, I know where you're coming from. That's not necessarily the case.
And plus, they don't care what you guys say unless you actually listen to them.
Yeah.
I have a thought. Now, this is in Genesis, and it's the curse. And when God is cursing Eve, says you will have pain during childbirth, and you will bring forth children. Yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm a Christian. I know that.
Yes.
And I accept that. I don't see that as oppressive.
Okay.
But feminists, it seems like it should have been from the very beginning that feminists are going to say, you are ruling over me and you're oppressing me.
Yeah, at every opportunity, they're, again, maintaining the different gradations of feminists and feminism. But generally speaking, at every opportunity, there is going to be the chance to pick out something and say that that's oppressive. right? So by virtue of the fact that your desire shall be for your husband, is that inherently oppressive? Because what if your husband is the best thing since sliced bread?
Right. Now, the way that I was told what that meant was, your desire will be to be the ruler,
Yeah.
to be in control,
Right.
but your husband is gonna be in that role.
I've heard that preached before. I've heard that preached before. Yeah, I've heard that preached before, and I think that there's a reason why it's preached that way, because of experiences, right? And just because of how things kind of dynamics sort of play out outside of all of those sorts of things. The fact that your desire shall be for your husband is not necessarily oppressive. Not necessarily, not inherently oppressive. So if we could turn to Ephesians 5:22 and 23, and when someone gets there, I'll ask you to read it.
Can I just say something about what we just read?
Yes, yes, yes.
With rule, I interpret that as he shall be like the head of the household, like the head of the family.
As a result of the curse. So what was he before the fall?
Good question.
Before the fall,
Yeah.
Equal.
God was the head of the household.
Mm-hmm. True, but did Adam have authority
Yes,
before the fall?
yes, he had to be.
So it's not necessarily the case that authority is a result of the fall.
No. When they got married, this is your wife. She will be flesh of your flesh, and you will leave your father and mother and choose her. It gave him authority.
Yeah, that's a good point that you bring up, because we have to think about that, because this authority and this positioning of God, is that a result of sin? Or did God design that from the very beginning?
I think God designed it. It's just the feminist part kicked in when the curse happened.
Yeah, if he designed it from the very beginning, all we can conclude is that the way people are having authority right now is tinged with sin.
Right, right.
So, yes.
No, I'm sorry, and I know we have time. I don't know how much more you have, but if you needed to continue, I know we're going on tangents here.
Okay.
But in light of trying to
I will, let me see. So can you just stop me when it's time to stop? Because I could go on.
Technically, you can keep going.
Okay.
And whoever needs to leave can leave.
Okay. Okay. So Ephesians 5:22-23, can someone read it?
22, 23, Ephesians 5.
Yes, ma'am.
Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior.
Okay, thank you. So that's one of the verses. That's one of the proof texts that people will use. What I want to say about that is context. So I think that you all have probably had lessons, etc., in context and hermeneutics and those sorts of things. So even though that's there in 5:22-23, we know that chapters and verses weren't in the original text, right? Like that was added later. These letters were given in their entirety to groups of people. So if we want to know what Paul's talking about, we should probably go to the beginning, at least the beginning-ish of the letter, right? So this passage, Ephesians 5:22-23, is in what theologians will call the household codes. Paul is concerned about teaching the new Christian believers how they ought to order themselves in Christ. That's why he talks about wives and husbands. He talks about children and parents. He talks about masters and slaves. In Corinthians, he's talking about how the church ought to order its own self. And even when I say the word slave, I promise what we think of the word slave today is not what Paul is talking about. That's just a caveat.
Right.
But if you go back to the beginning of what theologians will say is the start of the household code, that starts in Ephesians 4:25. And I'm not gonna ask everyone to read 4:25 to 5 and 1, but if you could just pick out some verses, read 4:25, read 20, read 27, 20, is there a 28? I don't know, and then just down to 5:1. So those verses, 4:25, 4:27, 4:28, and 5:1.
You want us to read it out
Yes,
loud?
please. Yeah, just someone, anyone, when you found it.
In 4:27, it starts and do not give the devil a foothold. So
Okay,
you
keep
wanna
going.
read
Yeah,
the part
keep
before
going.
that?
I'll stop you. It's go to that verse to 5:1.
Anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work, doing something useful with their own hands, that they may have something to share with those in need. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, with whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as Christ God forgave you.
That's good. Thank you. Okay.
Just to 5:1.
And then
Yeah, that's fine. You can stop
Okay.
there.
Okay.
Y'all get the point. So what I'm saying is that 5:22 is said after Paul has spoken to them and said, be kind to one another, be angry and sin not, don't grieve the Holy Spirit, don't lie to one another, he says as well. So there's all these things that Paul is saying to the church. And then in 5:23 he says, wives, submit to your husbands. So those things aren't divorced from each other. So Paul is giving that prescription in the context of Christian believers. Again, as a Christian, you're called to be a certain sort of person. And being that certain sort of person, here's how your life ought to be ordered. It's not oppressive in that context. But if you just pick out 5:22 and 23 and just run with that, you're forgetting the context that precedes Paul's prescription in 5:22 and 23. I want to say something about, well, let's do this. Is it Titus 1 and 9? If someone can turn there. I think it's Titus 1:9. I hope it is.
Holding fast the faithful word as he has been taught, that
No.
he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and to convince the gainsayers.
Okay, can you read 8? 8 and 9? What's 8?
But a lover of hospitality, a lover of good men, sober, just, holy, temperate. The one about a bishop?
Yes.
Okay, that's 7. For a bishop must be blameless as the steward of God, not self-willed, not soon angry, not given to wine, no striker, not given to filthy lucre, but a lover of hospitality, a lover of good men, sober, just, holy, temperate.
Okay, and there's also a passage, it might not be Titus, it might be Timothy, where Paul is saying that the qualifications of a bishop are that you run your household well, that if you can't run your household well, how do you expect to run the household of God? He says that the bishop must be the husband of one wife, right, which kind of assumes that it's going to be. So I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about those sorts of things, what they mean in the context of maybe your comment before. So if you look at the breadth of Paul's writing in this area, and even with what Jesus said before, what it means to bishop, what it means to pastor, what it means to lead, and what it means to govern. We can't assume that Paul's understanding of that is analogous to us. So in John 10, when is it John 10, the story of the Good Samaritan? It might be Luke 10. I'm sorry, I read the Bible.
It's all good. I haven't quite memorized it myself.
Okay, I think it's probably Luke 10. So it's the story of the Good Samaritan. So we have this. It's this story where there is a person in need of care, And the one who ultimately comes to help him picks him up, brings him to the nearest inn, and he tells the innkeeper, take care of this person, and whatever I owe you, I'll give it to you when I come back. Just take care of that person. The word there, care for, is the same word that was just in our passage before about the bishops caring for their household and caring for them well. So it's this idea, Paul's grand idea is that the bishop, the pastor, whatever you want to call it, it's not someone who gets the best parking spaces on Sunday morning. It's not someone who is elevated to like spiritual celebrity status, because sometimes we do that in church. The picture that Paul is painting of a bishop is a servant, one who serves and cares for the needs of others, one who has the ability and the provision to be able to take care of the needs of those to whom he is responsible. That's what it means to shepherd your house well. Even as Christ is the shepherd of his flock, even as Christ is the one who provides for the needs of the church, this is what's given to the man who shepherds his household well. So it is the case. So then when we talk about today and women's abilities to do certain things in church, can women do this? Can women do that? Can women do that? My position is, yeah, they can, but is that what the Bible is talking about, right? So we read the Bible like it's a book of functions. Functional definition and essential definition, right? But we read the Bible like it's the prescriptions, I'll say, like it's a book of functions. What it means to be a pastor is someone who preaches well, someone who does all of these sorts of things. But what if God is not concerned about function, but who you are as a person? What if he's concerned about that? Because if he's concerned about that, you can do all of these things and still not be that, right? So in Matthew 7:20, when Jesus is saying that many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord. They'll say, didn't we do miracles in your name? Didn't we cast out devils? Didn't we prophesy? Jesus is going to say, in effect, yeah, you did, but I didn't know you. So there's something about functions that follows who you are. Functions don't come before who you are, because you can do all these things and still not be that. So I'm saying in the context of like these church discussions that we have with like teachers and bishops and all of those sorts of things, ability is not the same thing as what God is calling you to be. What he's calling you to be and to do can happen in the absence of or in the presence of certain functions. So perhaps today in the church, in-house, we should be talking about what is God calling us to be and not what is he calling us to do.
It doesn't seem like though you addressed the core of it, which is kind of what are your thoughts on what the Bible says about women in leadership in churches?
Yeah, my thought is what the Bible teaches is that women are not to hold the responsibility of covering and caring for the needs and protecting the needs of the community. That was always given to men. Can they do it? Yes.
Sometimes better.
Sometimes better. And this is like an in-house discussion. So this is not a heaven-hell issue, right? So if you have like a woman pastor, you can get in still. Like it's not that serious to the point where your eternal destination is going to be determined on this. But we're talking about the best that we can, what the Bible is actually saying. So I don't see it possible where in the context of family, God has called men to be the providers and the protectors and the carers and all of these sorts of things, the ones who have authority and those sorts of things. I don't see him saying that, but then when we get into the house of God, it switches and it's different. Because a bishop is not only the carer and the provider of the community of believers, but the community of people that he has responsibility with on a personal basis. Now that's very different, again, that's very different from abilities. If we want to talk about abilities, some women are better at other things, right? Some women are better at, they can do, people can do things. It's not that sort of issue, but it's an issue of getting back to what God is actually calling us to live out.
Yeah, I would wholly agree with you. I don't think it's an ability thing.
It's not.
It's a role thing. It's an authority. It's how God ordered the family and the church. And it's exactly what we're supposed to be.
Yeah. And so one of the other things that I say too is imagine job. You're on your job and your supervisor, your boss, has given you a certain responsibility. Produce this data sheet by Friday. So you have that responsibility to do that. But at the very same time, he hasn't given you the authority to get in spreadsheets that you need to complete this data sheet that you're doing. You need access to certain pieces of data, and your boss hasn't given you that access to data. So how in the world are you going to produce the spreadsheet by Friday? This issue of authority and men and these sorts of things, they've been given a certain level of responsibility, and by virtue of that responsibility, they've been given certain authority to accomplish that responsibility. How frustrating and or impossible it would be to be responsible for something that we don't have authority over or to do. Right, so this authority, it's not the 19th century Hitler type authority. That's not what God is talking about. He's talking about the ability to function and carry out the sorts of things that I'm going to hold you responsible for.
Just like Eric talks often about the Trinity and how Jesus' submission to God the Father within the personhood.
Yeah.
It's very similar to that. It's not that Jesus was anything less. I mean, he is God. It's just different roles, different responsibilities.
And that submission is not oppressive.
It's not.
It's not at all.
It's actually like a load off.
Yeah.
A release.
Yeah. So it's really weird because you also.
We are 10 minutes over.
Okay, I'll finish in 5, and then you all can.
Discount's getting bigger.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
Admission discount.
So it's really weird because we have to acknowledge what has been done in the name of Christianity, right? So we have to acknowledge the certain sort of things, and we can acknowledge those certain sort of things and still affirm that those things did not meet the standard that God has for us, right? So, and you know, when Paul says wives submit to your husband, he doesn't say husbands make your wives submit to you.
But you know, and of course, that submission thing, that's something that a lot of people gravitate to, and they don't talk about the first part. And of course, the Lord, he says to treat your wives like Christ treated the church.
Yeah, that's 425. We always talk about 424.
Yeah, and you know, in all honesty, if our women were treated like Christ treated the church, they'd be, I mean, regardless of the definition of submit, they would be glad to do it.
Yeah, this discussion, I think I've been centering more so on females because the title of the talk is feminism. But there's certain responsibilities that men have to play too. There's certain things that men, fathers, those who have been given authority will have to answer to for God that women won't.
And also, in today's society, a lot of our men are falling short. I'm not saying you guys, but you know,
I am sure. That's it.
there's 3 that when you get the statistics, 3 out of every 5 law students and doctors are women. So they're excelling, but I don't know what's happened to the guys.
Feminism.
Yeah.
No.
When you go back, you go,
Absolutely.
if you go back,
You're gonna blame
Like being
that
Christian like right now.
on men not achieving.
No, I mean, we could go back historically and look at things like, you know, slavery and the Industrial Revolution and World War II, how when men left feminism overall, and talking about how the removal of men as a headship, the removal of men and saying that, they're not supposed to be leaders. Women they're better. They can rule. That's exactly what I think we've been talking about.
Well, that's true, but we have a lot of men that are still excelling in different fields, and they're still the provider.
I agree, but I would argue that most of those men grew up in complete homes, or homes where both the father and the mother were I don't know what's the word, nurturing, versus a broken home where a father left, and now the son is left without a father figure, and the mom has to try to raise a boy to be a man when she cannot, and and now he's running the streets, and I've seen it. I grew up in the streets. I'm actually almost a statistic of that, and it's cyclical. But I mean, there's a societal, a sociological aspect to what feminism has done to men, and where we are now, and especially in extended adolescence and all kinds of things like that, where it's okay for a man to hang around and play video games at 35 years old and live with his parents. But it's encouraged, and it's really just it's not just men doing it.
I think one of the funny things is if you look at the sitcoms that are on TV, they always make the guy, the husband, the doofus, the dummy, he's the loser, whatever it is, and it's always the wife that's got to pick up the pieces.
See, sociology talks about like manifest consequences and latent consequences. So the latent consequences, those are the things that just happen as a result of the manifest consequences. So manifest, Roe v. Wade, divorce, commercials, all of these sorts of things. Those things are manifestly happening. But the latent consequences are that men are no longer secure, that men don't know what women want, that men are concerned that if I say hi, I'm going to be in court tomorrow. Like, those are latent consequences of what has been rolling for the last 40, 50 or so years. So men's disappearance, if you want to call it disappearance from society, just hasn't happened overnight. There are certain things that have brought it to bear.
I think one of the main problems is that as human beings, male and female, disobedience, right? We don't want to accept the role that God had. We want to do it our way. And that causes a lot of the problem in the first place. Because if I fall in love with Jesus, then I got no problem submitting to his rule over me. But by being a slave of Christ, that also not only makes me submissive to him and his perfect rule, but it also means he's got responsibilities over me, which is huge. Takes a big burden off my shoulder, kind of like the female submits to the man, and he is responsible for her, to love her and all that, of course. But it's really on why we reject the role that God in his perfect design created to our own detriment. Because when we, I don't know how to cut you off.
You're fine.
Just to finish up.
Yeah.
Because when we do interact in the roles by God's design, and in any area of our life for that matter, when we rest in God's design, things are beautiful. The way they were supposed to be. The way he designed it. Well, we want to buck the system. Like we know better than God, right? Like I know better than God, right?
So we're creatures of free will. Like at the end of the day, we can choose whatever we choose to do. But if we do things that aren't conducive, like you were saying, to the way that we're supposed to operate, that's
our temperaments though have a lot to do with how we react to so many things. They have to be conditioned to fall into the category of God's word. I mean, temperaments, if you're a choleric, what are you going to be? You're going to be controlling, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. So there are different personalities, right? So there are some personalities, melancholies, that don't necessarily have the same battles that cholerics have. But all of us as believers of Christ are called to come under the transforming work of the Holy Spirit. So your issue might not be anger. Like there are certain personalities that they are just kind of prone to certain things. You still have to come under the subjection of Christ. There are certain personalities that are quietly arrogant, quietly angry. You still have to come under subjection to the work of the Lord. So in all respects, as those who follow Christ, we're called to be changed and conformed to the image of Christ. And we're called to do that, and it ought to have effect in our interactions one with the other.
Can I ask you to answer the next question?
Yes. Okay, so that first question is good, right? So,
and it's really probably the next one. No, the next. There, the Bible is 6. Well, I guess you already have.
Which one? The Bible? Is the Bible a tool of oppression?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, see, our daughter's a feminist.
Okay.
And so she says that the Bible is basically, her word was BS. And she said because it was written by a bunch of men.
Okay.
And she says that we got on the topic about marriage, and she said, well, my husband, we're going to be equal.
Okay.
And so I'm like, that's not what it's supposed to be. And I'm trying to explain it to her.
Well, equal in what sense?
Well,
equally
she's
human?
not going to submit to him.
Oh, okay. Well,
He's not going to control her.
Okay.
Are they married yet?
No, she's.
Wait, okay, so I don't want to like
Oh, she
speak
hasn't found
doom
this guy
and
yet.
gloom.
Okay.
No.
But practically speaking, it's going to be interesting to see what that dynamic is like in 5 years.
Well, hopefully she'll have changed in her.
Hopefully. Right, like you can choose to do whatever you want to choose, but there's going to be certain blatant consequences. So you can go into it thinking, I'm not gonna listen to him. Fine, okay, so then one of the latent consequences of that is he's not gonna feel respected, because that's just how men are. So then one of the latent consequences of not feeling respected is gonna lead to other things. So you can choose to do those sorts of things, but, and this isn't necessarily the case that only Christians have successful marriages. No, that's not necessarily the case. All you have to do is base your marriage on truth, right? So that's kind of the sorts of things that you think before you're actually married, and then when you get married, you're like, this is not actually how it works.
Yeah, she's just 19. So
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
She's still got to grow up.
Yeah. So, and just to your first comment that the Bible is oppressive because it was written by men. You know, I don't really think that people believe as surely and as truly the things that they believe, right? So without getting into her ideas about abortion, those sorts of things, Roe v. Wade was decided by 9 white men. But by virtue of the fact that it was decided by 9 white men, do you not agree with Roe v. Wade? Like, what you look like, what someone looks like, has very little to do with the value of their content and what they're saying, right? So so would the Bible be more truer because it was written by women? No, it would probably read differently, but truth isn't concerned with XX's and XY's. Truth is that which corresponds to what really is. So,
I should explain to her how God had used women throughout the Bible.
Yeah, that's a lot
Yeah.
of women.
To
I have to go.
okay.